Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me personally, my name is Amichai Magen. I'm a member of faculty here at the Law School of Government. I'm a senior researcher at the ICT, focused mainly on governance and political violence. And I also head our MA program in diplomacy and conflict studies for any potential MA students who are here in the room. We have some very successful and distinguished alumni. Buongiorno, Marcello. Come stai? Yeah, Marcello. One of our graduate who's now with the Interpol, previously with the UN. So again, the Italians go from strength to strength. So first of all, I want to thank Richie Wood very much. Also Daphne, who's in the room until a moment ago, for their great assistance and organizational help. What we want to do today is to talk about NATO, 70 years of contribution to peace and security. And what I thought we will do, since we have quite a lot of time, we have a sort of 3 hours for this workshop in total. So what I thought we'll do is I'll just to make a few framing remarks about history and the current situation and maybe some of the emerging issues. Then we will hear from each one of our distinguished panelists, and we'll sort of do it I think in 3 phases. One, I think sort of Benedetta and Jan will give us an organizational and strategic depth and a view on the state of NATO and the challenges and sort of where we go from here. Then we'll shift to the Middle East and maybe the North Africa, Middle East arena. And that, I think, will be a natural segue to a more specific focus on counter-terrorism. Then we'll take, I think by then we'll all be ready to take a little bit of a break. Let's be disciplined about the break, 15 minutes, get recaffeinated, whatever we need to do. But then we come back, and we come back for a discussion, and an open discussion, which I always find to be the most important and most fruitful part. We'll be able to identify holes, connect themes, but it's a workshop. We treat this as a seminar, so you are equal partners in this discussion, and we want to have a sort of a shared group discussion. Okay, so just a few just a few framing remarks from me. So 2019 is a year that we mark what are really 3 historic anniversaries. The 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, the famous sort of end of history moment, the moment where the Cold War infrastructure was put into question. Is this still relevant? And the so-called post-Cold War international order, Pax Americana, the liberal international moment, was sort of born, and we are marking 30th anniversary in some respects in a rather gloomy way, because we feel that our holiday from history is over, that history is back, and we ask ourselves what has happened, and to this short spring of globalism, the spread of democracy, the rule of law, and all those hopes that we had 30 years ago. Today, on this very day, we also mark a very painful anniversary, the 18th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. So if you think about it, a baby born on this day 18 years ago is reaching adulthood, reaching maturity today. She will be able to vote. She's Israeli. She will go and fight in the Israeli army. So we're almost a generation out of 9/11, and that of course raises questions. Are we safer? Are we living after 18 years of a sort of a global war on terror? Where are we in this? Do we have the institutions? Do we have the culture? Do we have the alliances that we need to address these this species of political violence. And of course, 2019 is also the 70th anniversary of the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was founded in April 1949. And 70 years today is not quite a lifetime, a human lifetime. I don't know if you're following this, but there's been a dramatic increase in global life expectancy. So that an average human being on planet Earth today can expect to live something like 75 years, almost 75 years. In 1950, it was below 50. That was the life expectancy. So, you know, the miracle of modernity continues. But 70 is a good moment to, you know, to ask questions about, you know, the past, the present, and also when one reaches 70, one quite naturally thinks about decay and decline, right? Possibly. I'm not quite yet there yet, but that's what I'm told. So without sort of over anthropomorphizing this, we can ask these kind of very human questions about NATO itself, right? At this stage. And I suspect, I mean, we're going to focus on NATO today, but I suspect those three anniversaries converse with one another, and they are in conversation with one another, and we want to sort of bear that in mind. In a moment, I will say, I think I will sort of outline several deep challenges to NATO today. I think that in 1989, NATO did face a kind of crisis, but it was a very, I think, different kind of crisis than the one faced today. In a way, it was a happier crisis, and it was a more immediate and sharp kind of crisis. And the crisis was for an institution that was set up to really manage Cold War tension. Suddenly, the raison d'etre of the original founding of NATO sort of vanished. And NATO was sort of facing a very typical midlife crisis, which is sort of what's my meaning now? What's my role in this new world? But as I say, I think it was a much happier crisis because there was a sense that of triumph. There was a sense of that NATO's original mission has been achieved. The Cold War has been managed successfully. We did not have either, you know, a return of great power, violent confrontation that's conventional or unconventional, and that was a huge success. So NATO had to reinvent itself in a way in 1989, 1991. Today, there is a sense that NATO, I think, has to reinvent itself once again. But the geopolitics has become much murkier. Western confidence, democratic confidence is much reduced compared to 30 years ago. And it also seems that the connectivity of the world is much greater, and just the range and type of challenges that we face today are more diffuse and confusing and complex than they were 30 years ago. So let me say that I think today we are facing questions about unity, internal unity. We're facing questions about purpose, and we are facing questions about the ability of NATO to adapt to what is, you know, a rapidly transforming, but in some respect also sort of darkening geopolitical global reality. Let me just mention on the level of headlines, because I'm sure our experts will be able to expound on this and say much more about this, but just to sort of set us up and to also provoke the members of the panel a little bit in terms of some of the themes that we might want to touch upon, let me mention several challenges that I see coalescing currently and maybe looking 5 or 10 years ahead that we should be thinking about. So perhaps the two best known contemporary challenges to NATO have to do with American leadership and with American commitment to European defense, right? I mean, this is something that we hear about a lot. And the sort of current lack, specifically of US presidential commitment to the alliance, is something that I think is is quite unprecedented. Trump openly ambivalent about NATO's value, public questioning of America's Article 5 commitment, and so on and so on and so forth. Is this something that is temporary? Is this something that NATO can recover from either in 2020 or 2024? Or is this American withdrawal, the empty throne, as somebody has recently described this, is this something that's going to continue after Mr. Trump is no longer in the White House? Again, either in 2020 or 2024. I think this is a sort of a cardinal question. The second very well-known issue is one of European defense spending. Only 5, and Benedetta will be able to correctly, Jan will be able to correctly, and others. My figures indicate that only 5 out of the 29 members of the alliance currently spend 2% or more of their GDP on defense. The US spends 3.5% of GDP. Germany spends only 1.2%. So it's true that over the past few years, the aggregate spending on defense by NATO allies has increased, but still there is that sense of that the Europeans are not paying their way and they're not sort of carrying their weight. And I think this raises a question about this 2% defense spending target. Is this something tangible? Is this something that we really need to worry about? And the related question, if there is an increase in spending, is that increase going into the right places? Is it going to the right places? Or is this discussion about 2% spending on defense a little bit of a red herring, and we should think about rearmament and building of military capacities in Europe in a somewhat different way than what we did in previous generations. Okay, so those are like two topics that are in the news all the time, and we know about them. But I want to just very quickly mention a few other things that are less sort of commonly discussed. NATO is traditionally seen as an alliance of democracies, as sort of a Western values democracy. This was sort of part of the legitimizing narrative of NATO. And it is true that during the Cold War, not all NATO members were high-quality, consolidated liberal democracies throughout their life. Let's remember that Greece, Portugal, and Turkey were members in good standing of NATO during their various periods of military rule throughout the Cold War. But we sort of assumed that post end of the Cold War, that community of values, that community of democracy was there. It was strong, and it really provided a very strong legitimation for NATO. But that's no longer the case. And now I don't want to get into discussions. Is Poland still a democracy? Is Hungary still a democracy? What about Turkey, etc.? Right? We could debate that, but we certainly see a sort of a crisis of values, not only in the sort of post-communist countries, but also some would argue within the heart of the West. So what's the relationship between commitment to democracy, Western values, the rule of law, and NATO's situation at the moment? I think the country that raises the biggest issues in this regard at the moment is not Hungary, but it's Turkey. And we see the cozying up of Turkey to Russia, questions about Turkey's place within the alliance, and this has become very, very concrete over the last several months with Turkey's decision to purchase from Russia the S-400 missile system, and the American response of saying, if you go ahead with that, we will not supply you with the F-35s, etc. So clearly the values issues has repercussions, because it raises the possibility of members of NATO actually allying themselves with Russia or other authoritarian powers in the international system. Okay, Russia is something that I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about, and the Russian threat. I'll just mention two terms in this regard: hybrid warfare, cyber capabilities, information warfare. What is NATO doing to better prepare itself in dealing with Russia? two or three additional points. The legacy of Afghanistan, how it ends, and the implications for NATO's posture vis-a-vis what we would call fragile states or areas of limited statehood and global jihad. I know this is an area that Benedetta has done a tremendous amount of work on. You know, after 18 years of combat, Afghanistan is NATO's largest and longest combat mission. We see that, you know, how to put this politely, a Jeffersonian democracy has not emerged in Afghanistan and is unlikely to emerge. Even over the past week, we've seen this rather anarchic discussions, you know, yes, deal with the Taliban, no deal with the Taliban, and so on and so forth. How is the legacy of Afghanistan affecting NATO? How is it either spurring or retarding NATO's adaptation to dealing with what I prefer to call areas of limited statehood, fragile states, and non-state actors? Is the counterinsurgency, state-building, restoration of state-based governance agenda that was sort of in the DNA, certainly of the United States and other Western allies, is that essentially over? Or are we likely, or will we be compelled for NATO to not only think about but act in terms of securing stability and stable governance, out of the understanding that if we don't do that, if we don't address the governance issues, we're just going to have Al-Qaeda 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0, because territory and population that we leave without responsible and stable governance is going to be exploited by radical non-state armed groups. Where is that agenda going forward? And finally, looking a little bit further ahead into the horizon, is the question of competition with China and the digital revolution in military affairs. The emergence of China as a global competitor, I don't want to say enemy, I don't want to say foe, but as a global competitor, politically, economically, militarily, and the rapid transformation of the military technology landscape. I think over the past couple of years in particular, there is a waking up, certainly in the United States, but also in Europe and elsewhere, that if before we sort of saw China as a potential responsible stakeholder, as an actor that could be accommodated within existing multilateral institutions, etc., I sense that the mood has changed and is darkened, and there's much greater concern today about China as a competitor, much greater understanding that China could actually take the lead on things like artificial intelligence and mechanized weapon systems and so on and so forth. How does that impact NATO and NATO's mission? So we have a rich and varied agenda, and I don't think I've even mentioned the word terrorism once in this context, but that sort of goes without saying. Okay, good. So we're going to start with Dr. Benedetta Berti, a dear friend, lived in Israel for many years, fabulous scholar. She is today the head of policy planning in the Office of the Secretary General at NATO. Then we're going to turn to another dear friend, Mr. Jan Teschau, who's a senior fellow and director of the Europe program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He's based in Berlin, but also worked in NATO for many years in the past. We are then going to switch to North Africa and the Middle East, and we will hear from Mr. Ariel Shafransky, Director of Multilateral European Organizations Department, the European Division in the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then our very own Tommy Steiner, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy right here at the IDC in Herzliya. Last but not least, Mr. Gabriel Cascone. Oh, perfecto. I pronounced that properly. Cascone, the head of the Counter-Terrorism section in the Emerging Security Challenges Division of NATO. And he's going to focus us on the counter-terrorism issues. So without further ado, Benedetta, please, the floor is yours.